Okay.
All right, from snakes we went to blood. The Nile turned into blood.
Right.
That was quite an experience. And then when that was all finished, then the frogs came. And then we finally get rid of them. And the Pharaoh took a breather, but not for long, because right after the frogs, then came the lice. And this time the Khartoumim, the wizards, they couldn't replicate this. And they said, maybe this is Etzbel Ekimhi, maybe this is a finger of God. Because as when they saw that they couldn't replicate this, they said, this must be from God. This can only be from the Creator. There's nothing to work with. It's too small. The louse is too small. Which brings us to the fourth Makkah. That's what we're going to focus on today. Parshas Vaera, middle of the fifth reading, chapter 8, verse 16. Vayemer Hashem al Moshe. So God now tells Moses, Hashkem b'boker, make sure you're up early in the morning. V'hisyatzev lifnei Pharaoh, you'll stand before the Pharaoh. Hine yotze hamayma, you know his routine. He's going out to the water. V'yamar to'elav, and you'll say to him, Kei yamar Hashem, this is what the Lord God said. Shalach ami v'yavduni, send forth my nation, and they will serve me. You'll note, of course, that it does not say, let my people go free. That's what Charlton Heston said, not Moses. Moses said, let my people, send them forth and let them serve God, because this is really about serving Hashem. And this is a line that's repeated multiple times. And what will happen if I won't? And if I don't listen to you? If you don't listen to me. Ki, because, im eincha, if you will not, mishalech esami, send forth my nation, hinini mashliach b'cha, and I will send against you, uva avadecha, and against your servants, uva amcha, and against your nation, uva vatecha, and in your homes, people and the real estate. What will I send? Es he'oroiv, this mixed multitude of wild animals. Umalu batei Mitzrayim, they will fill the homes of Egypt. They'll become filled as ha'arev with these mixed multitude of wild animals. V'gam ha'adama asher heim aleha, and even the earth that they are upon. So let's take a look at Rashi. First and foremost, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Im eincha mishaleach, if you will not send, so then hineni mashliach, then I will send against you. So Rashi says, even though people tend to think that the word eincha mishaleach, which comes from sending forth, shares a common root with the idea of mashliach. It sounds so similar. You don't send, I will send. It's going to be to say eye for an eye, send for a send. But Rashi says no. Actually, that's not what it means. The word mashliach comes from the terminology of hashlacha, means incitement. I will migarevecha. I will incite, I will drive these animals insane and incite them and anger them against you. To be their anger should be directed against you. That's the meaning of mashliach. And Rashi proves this. He says, because if you look in the book of Deuteronomy in the 32nd chapter, it speaks there in the Teichacha, in the rebuke, that's part of Shiras Hazinu, that it says if the Jewish people will not keep the Torah properly, will not be loyal to Hashem, that He will incite the animals, v'shen behemis hashalach bam, that He will, so to speak, set the teeth of the animals. Wild animals will bite the Jewish people. And over there it doesn't mean send. Over there clearly it means lashon shisui. Over there it means to enrage, to incite. What we call in English to sick a dog on somebody. God says, I will sick the animals on you. So it sounds mashliach, it sounds very nicely rounded, Imeincha mishaleach hineni mashliach, but actually what it means is I will enrage and incite the animals against you. Es ha'arev. What is the arev? It's like this noun. The arev. What is the arev? So Rashi says arev comes from the terminology of irvuvia. Irvuvia means a mix, a motley mix. Kol mine chayes rois and Goshen v'akravim. There'll be all kinds of wild animals, bad animals who are violent, and you'll have snakes too, and scorpions, and it'll all come birvuvia. It'll all come mixed. V'hoyu mashchisim bahem, and they were attacking them, violently attacking them. And now Rashi says, V'yesh tam b'davar. There's a reason why this was chosen, why this makas happened in this order. And now Rashi quotes Be'agoda. It's found in the Agadic Midrashim. It says, B'chol mako lama zu v'lama zu. Why this one? Why that one? And all of it's related, Rashi says, in a level of pshuta shel mikra, and a literal level to tachsisei milchames malachim, to the strategy of a king, of a monarch who would set his armies against an enemy. So what would you do? Keseder malchus, like a government, like an attacking army, kishetzara al ir, when it lays siege on a city. Betchila, what's the first thing you do? The first thing you do is you try to cut off the supply of water, of hydration. Betchila mekalkel es mayin eseh. The first thing you do is you try to ruin the source of fresh drinking water. And this will, of course, deprive the defenders of the city of drinking water. And if they have no drinking water, there's nothing to talk about. Can't. How are you going to defend the city? After you take away their hydration, then you bring these terrific noisemakers and scare the gazookies out of them. You know, then the Israelis were defending themselves in 1948. They were outgunned and outnumbered and everything but outfoxed. They were very smart. So they had this little gun. It's like a tiny little cannon on a tripod. They call it the Davidka. If you go today outside the Shuk Machne Yehud, if you take like a block down to Agrippas, you'll still see they have a Davidka. It's called the Davidka Square. And what happened is that this little gun didn't do much damage, but it made terrific noise. And this was used as a weapon primarily not for the impact, but for the noise that it made. And they say, in large measure, this is one of the most important weapons the Israelis had at the time. We had to defend Israel at the time, was this little cannon that didn't do very much damage, but the noises were tremendous. And it made them think that we had all kinds of artillery behind us, and we're going to be able to defend ourselves, and it struck fear in the heart of the enemy. So this is what the next thing you do is you bring out these terrific noisemakers and you make these unbelievable ear-splitting sounds. And this is liyaram, to make them frightened, ulavalam, and to confuse them. And so the first is obvious. HaKadosh Baruch Hu took the natural source of water of Mitzrayim, which is the Nilus, the Nile River, and its many tributaries, and what happened? It turned into blood. And then the frogs came. V'chein hatzfardim mekarkarim v'hoimim. The frogs couldn't bite. They wouldn't have teeth. Although there's an opinion they were little alligators, but in most opinions they were frogs. But did they make a noise? The people couldn't eat and couldn't sleep day and night. A noise, a din. It was unbelievable. Millions of frogs, all making noises at the same time. So Rashi is trying to tell you over here, there is a rhyme and a reason, there's an order, there's a strategy. This is the slow dismantling of the Egyptian spirit and ultimately the entire nation. All right, so now we know a little bit about this wild mixed multitude. How did it impact the Jewish people? Very good question. Hold that thought. Next verse. But first, I just want to share with you the words of the Sifsei Kohanim. The Shachal HaTorah says that when the Pharaoh would send his taskmasters against the Jewish people, they would gnash their teeth like wild animals. They appeared to the Jewish people like lions and bears. They were terrified of them. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, "You terrified my children? I'll show you fear." And he sent actual lions and bears. Seems that the Arev, according to the Sifsei Kohanim, the Arev was led by wild lions and bears. And the lions and bears had no mercy. Now it's interesting, it says that the Arev will come b'cha, in you, uva avadecha, in your servants. So the Pharaoh's inner circle was not protected, quite the contrary. Uva amcha, the ordinary citizens. Uva vatecha, they'd be in the homes. So it's both the people, the population, and the real estate. And then it says, after that, umalu bate Mitzrayim, v'gam ha'adama. The homes will fill, and also the earth. So Rashi doesn't say anything, he doesn't comment. But the Ibn Ezra says this means there's areas, the parks and recreation areas, or even maybe the rural areas where people didn't live. There weren't as many people living. So you think you want to escape the Arev, you go out to where the people don't live, because they're attacking the people, the population. When you came there, you found the Arev too. They were everywhere. There was no shortage of lions, bears, and the whole menagerie that followed. But the Rebbeinu Shalom had enough to fill the cities, and to fill the parks, and to fill the outer areas. They were everywhere. Everywhere you went, they were there. And it was terrible. The Sefarno says something very interesting. He says, V'gam ha'adama means that usually a person, if he's afraid of what's going on out there, what does he do? Goes in here. Goes into his home. So they went into the homes. They locked the doors. They boarded up the windows. And then all of a sudden, the animals started coming out of the ground. In the house. They dug tunnels. They tunneled underneath. And these animals were coming up, so there was no security. They thought they were safe and secure. They secured a home. They boarded the doors. They nailed all the windows shut. They at least were safe. And all of a sudden, from the ground, they're coming up. Can you imagine? In today's day and age, out of the toilets they're coming. Nobody was safe. And now, as to your question, David, verse 18. V'hifleisi bayemahu was Eretz Goshen. On that day, I will set aside the land of Goshen. Asher ami oimeid aleha, which my nation stands upon it. Levilti hayes from Arev, so that there will be no mixed multitude of animals there. Leman teda, so that you will know, ki ani Hashem bekerev haaretz, that I am God in the midst of the earth. So if an Egyptian wanted safety, where's the only place he could find respite? He had to go to the ghetto. You have to beg the Jews, please, can I stay in your house a little? Can I please stay in your neighborhood? Please don't throw me out of your parks. Whatever they had areas, because that was the only place that the Arev didn't go. Rashi says the word vihiflesi has to be understood like literally vihifrashti. I will separate, set aside. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu set Goshen apart from all of the other areas. V'chein, similarly, we read later when we're going to hear about the pestilence that struck the livestock of the Egyptians. It says, V'hifla Hashem. Hashem made a distinction between the Miknei Yisrael and between Miknei Mitzrayim, the livestock of Israel, the Israelites, and the livestock of the Egyptians. And now Rashi says, I will show you that this idea of hafla or hiflesi is connected to being separated or set aside. V'chein, we find similarly in the very end of the Torah where Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the Jewish people and he describes the mission, the mandate, the responsibility, the privilege of being a Torah Jew, of listening to Hashem. He says people will say it's too hard. It's too hard, I can't do this. It's too difficult, it's insurmountable. But it's not so. It says, Lo nifleisi mincha. Moshe Rabbeinu says it's not impossible for you. It's not beyond you. You think it's beyond you. It's not. In other words, Lo muvdelas umufreshes imucha. It is not separated. It is not cast aside. It is not beyond you. That would be a mistake to think. The truth is that Torah mitzvahs is karev elecha. It's very, very close to us. So there we have the same idea of hiflesi, which is the notion of set aside, pushed aside, at a distance. Leman teda. Why will all this be? Leman teda ki ani Hashem, that you will know I am God b'kerev haaretz. Af al pi sheshchinasi b'shamayim. Even though the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is proverbially in the heavens. You know, people say, lift your eyes heavenward, you daven. Nonetheless, God says, what I say happens right here on earth. In other words, even b'kerev haaretz, even in the midst of the earth, not stam in the earth, b'kerev haaretz. We know that the word aretz, Chassidus says, comes from the terminology of artzius, which means earthiness, and that which seems very fleshy, very physical, very mundane, very literal, very dense, very unspiritual. And God is right there too. B'kerev, right in the midst of all that, in the middle of all the Gashmias, right there, the Rebbeinu Shalom, the master of heaven and earth, is there as well. Now the Targum Yonason suggests that the word v'hiflesi, although he doesn't necessarily disagree with Rashi, means set aside, but he says there's also a secondary meaning. It also comes to the term of hafla, that it would be wondrous, that people would just amazed, how is the animals know where not to go? At the exact property, they went up to the property line, but not further. It was like this invisible fence. They went right up, and nobody went in. And the animals were out of control. And yet somehow, they had this remarkable self-control when it came to the end. That was extraordinary. What does it mean? Asher Ami Oimid Aleh, my nation stands. They didn't stand; they were living there. So Onkelos says Ami Sheichen, where we dwell. So why we use the terminology Oimid? So the Malbim suggests it was as if the Jewish people were standing guard. That's what it looked like. Because the animals were terrified to go past a certain line, as if somebody was preventing them. And this was like, what was going on over here? Like a nace, yeah. So here David becomes a question, and you asked this right away. He said, what happened for the Jewish people? This is the first time we actually hear of a distinction being drawn between the nation of Israel and the Egyptians. It doesn't say there was. Hashem said blood, and there'll be a distinction. Frogs, and there'll be a distinction. Lice, and there'll be. It doesn't say that. Here it says there'll be a distinction.
So Israel suffered from frogs and lice.
So the Ibn Ezra maintains that on the other Makkos, the Nile was blood everywhere, and he says frogs were everywhere. Obviously, they didn't go into the Jewish people's ovens, and they didn't jump down their throats. And if you start reading the Mefarshim about the kind of lice that they were, they looked like the abominable snowmen. I mean, these guys were covered with many tons of. They walked around like this, covered with lice. They were like walking around like a snowstorm. So obviously that wasn't the case for the Jewish people. They weren't attacked in the same way. But there was lice. It was an itchy time, and frogs were everywhere. So the frogs didn't attack the Jewish people. True. They weren't in their bed and in their ovens and down the throat, but the frogs were everywhere. It wasn't obvious. Now we know the Egyptians didn't have any water. Even the water that was in their cisterns, the water was in their jugs, everything turned to blood. That didn't happen for Bnei Yisrael. But the river that flowed through, the various tributaries that flowed through the area of Goshen, were also flowing blood. But here it was clear and obvious that this was only in the area where the Egyptians were. Not a single Israelite area had a single wild animal, even though the animals were out of control. Yep. So on page Kufnum Beis here, the Rebbe in the 27th century of Birur Chumash, he notes that the fact that the Torah mentions the hafloya, the separation between Yisrael and Mitzrayim l'rishoyin b'makas arev, first and foremost in makas arev, so it seems al pi pshuta shel mikra that the other three makas, the first three makas, also impacted the lives of the Jewish people. Their lives were disrupted through Dam and Tzfardea and Kinim. Of course, and that's what Ibn Ezra says, there's a famous question which is posed by the Radvaz, where the Radvaz says, well, if the first three Makkos hit the Jews and the Egyptians equally, then how is Pharaoh supposed to draw a conclusion that he better be nice to the Jews? Well, I mean, it was almost pointless. Mm-hmm. So the Mefarshim say the Pharaoh wasn't that stupid, and you could see differences. Like we said, here it was only the Nile for the Jewish people. For the Egyptians, it was all the water, their personal water supplies. Jewish people, it wasn't. The frogs were much, much more aggressive with regard to the Egyptians. And, the Pharaoh sent his people and they analyzed the situation. You could see a difference, but it wasn't an obvious and overt difference. Why not? Why takanat? Why didn't God spare the Jewish people any kind of discomfort in the first three plagues? So the Rebbe suggests that in a level of Pshuta Shel Mikra, it had to be this way. It had to be this way. Because in these other makkahs, there was a hechrech miyuchad, there was a special need, shaloi lahafleis, that there should not be a distinction, that the Jewish area should not seem apart. And therefore, even though maybe it would diminish the impact on Pharaoh, because Pharaoh said, okay, but they have lice too, right? Yeah, oh, sir, they don't have lice like we have lice. They're not walking around with mountains of lice, but they have lice too. They have some lice too. Okay, fine. So the Pharaoh knew that there was a clear difference between the Israelites. They weren't being stricken, whereas his people were being literally attacked. But still, there was enough for him to say, well, they have lice too. He said, the frogs are everywhere? Yeah, the frogs are there. Tell me, the frogs are violently jumping down their throats? We don't hear any reports of that, sir. How about they're in their oven? No, but they're frogs. They are frogs. So it diminished the impact on Pharaoh. When he heard that the blood was everywhere, okay, they needed blood, they had to buy water from the Jewish people. But still, the Nile was blood, and all of its tributaries, the ponds, were blood everywhere. So the Rebbe says it had to be this way. And why did it have to be this way? It had to be this way because when it came to the Makkah of Dam and Tzfardea first, Ikar HaMatorah, the primary purpose of these Makkahs was Lahakes, Es HaNilus, was to strike the Nile, as Rashi said in his commentary in the beginning of the Makkos. This is because it was Yerusam Shel Mitzrayim. They revered the Nile River. They worshipped the Nile River. It was their God. What did they worship? Money. Just like in Canada, they worship money. And because they worship money, what did they worship? The Nile River. Because where did prosperity come from? If not from the Nile River. Nah, it wasn't big commerce there. Agriculture. When the rest of the world was suffering drought and famine, what was going on in Egypt? They were booming. Now, during the most difficult famine, even Egypt didn't have that. Was Joseph's ingenuity. But otherwise, as a rule, they never suffered famine typically. Why? Because if it didn't rain, it didn't make a difference to them. It's an African desert country. And because it's an African desert country, if there's no rain, how did they grow crops? From irrigation, from the Nile River. And they had a very, very sophisticated system of irrigation. Probably the most sophisticated of its time. They were centuries ahead of themselves. And the Nile was there. In Israel, what do you have in Israel? If it doesn't rain, you better pray, man. We have a whole Masechet, a whole tractate called Tainus. What do you do in Israel if the rains don't come? You ever see the mighty Jordan River? It's a joke. So maybe once was a little bit more impressive, but it's a river's a river, right? The Nile is still a river. The Euphrates is a river. The Jordan, yeah, a creek at best by Canadian standards, barely a creek. So they had rivers, they had water, and because they had water, this was their God. You had water, you have prosperity. You had prosperity, you had commerce, you had export and import, you had a lebedige Welt. So they worship that. So the Eibishter says, that's what you worship? I'll show you who's God. And therefore, the entirety of the Nile River had to be stricken. All of it had to turn into blood. Gam b'mayim shebe'eretz Goshen, including the tributaries in the river that was in the area of Goshen. Why? What would happen otherwise? Because the areas where the Jewish people lived, the Nile River wouldn't be stricken. What would Pharaoh come to the conclusion? The Nile is still God. It just depends which part of the Nile. We worship the wrong piece of the Nile. In fact, we should hate the Jews even more. They took away our God. Look, in their part of the Nile River, it didn't turn to blood. So the Nile has not been vanquished, so to speak. And that which they worship still retains its place of reverence in Egyptian society. And the same thing is also true with regard to the frogs. Where did the frogs come from? From the Nile. Which part of the Nile? Every part of the Nile. And if it wouldn't come from a certain part of the Nile, then you would say, well, maybe this part of the Nile is really God. Maybe this is the source of strength. And similarly, when it comes to the Makkah of Kinim, as we started off today by mentioning Etzbe Lekimi, the wizards and the wise men and the scientists said, we think this might be a finger of God. Why? Because they said we need something to work with, to manipulate. There's nothing here. It's too small. In other words, this showed the power of God that is bilti mugbelas, that is limitless, that God could take the tiniest object, an item, and that too, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had total control over and mastery.
The expression finger of God, is that a compliment or a diminishment? Like, what does that mean exactly?
It means they said, we give up. This is not just a more sophisticated form of witchcraft or black magic, which was like the science of the day. These guys aren't just a little smarter or better at our game. We don't know what this game is. People speak about this today. Doctors, even very arrogant doctors who claim to be atheists, when they'll say, "Oh, this is a hand of God." It means it's inexplicable. When the insurance companies don't want to pay for damage, you know what they call it? The hand of God. Act of God. Sorry. Act of God. Hand of God. It means beyond. It's beyond us. So therefore, because that was the notion of Kinim had to be everywhere. If Kinim wouldn't be somewhere, so God is not infinite and omnipotent. He's not everywhere. It had to be everywhere. But the first time, finally, we get to number 4. Finally, there is no good reason why the Israelites should not be fully spared, and so they were fully spared. Not a single squirrel, if he was wild, went into the wrong area. Nobody bothered the area of Goshen. And that's why it says, V'hifleisi b'yemahu. Here it was abundantly clear to the Pharaoh. Not only they suffered less, the Jewish people were under some kind of clear protection from a higher place. And seeing this, the Pharaoh should have caved in. And he would have. except God didn't let him. To be continued.
Thank you.